Hey, welcome to another episode of Mountaineer Kingdom Do Talk, Real Men, Manly Talk.
And today we have Craig Erhard on today. He's running for Marion County Circuit Court Judge. Welcome. Thank
Thank
you for
you.
coming on and joining us on our podcast. I know you personally, but a lot of people don't. So that's kind of why we're having you on to get your face out there and what you want to get across out there to everybody. So let's just take an opportunity to get to know you better as a person, as a lawyer, and when you're elected, who you're going to be, and how you're going to be the new circuit judge. So tell us about yourself.
I've been a practicing lawyer in Marion County for 25 years. I practice in state and federal courts. Sometimes the federal courts may take me as far north as Wheeling or as far east as Martinsburg, um, Elkins, Clarksburg, and been doing that for many, many years. I try cases. I'm a litigator, so I also do appellate work though in both state and federal court. Um, and I do civil practice, criminal practice. I, you never want to say you're an expert in anything, in my opinion, and I'm not that. But I have been practicing for a long time, and I enjoy it. You know, I mean, I was fortunate to find something that I liked. I think you're really fortunate to be able to do that, and
Yeah.
so yeah, I like it.
So you're a litigator.
Yes.
Tell us what that
Well,
entails.
you know, you have different divisions, I suppose, of practice areas. Some people call document generation transactional lawyers. So if you wanted to put a deal together or a regulatory consolidation or something like that, that typically happens in bigger cities. But you're a transactional lawyer. You may type up contracts. You may help to negotiate those contracts and things like that. A litigator tries cases. So ever since the procedural rules were promulgated, there are far fewer trials than there used to be. The feds promulgated procedural rules in '38. West Virginia followed in '64. And the idea was that our founders crafted a trial to be a truth-seeking venture. It's interesting. Much of the Bill of Rights comes from the Bible, much if not all. The Sixth Amendment, for example, has several rights in it, like a lot of the amendments do. The right to confront your accusers is in the Sixth Amendment. It's also where the right to counsel clause is. And the right to, they call that the confrontation clause, the Sixth Amendment. It comes from the story where they brought the adulterous woman and Jesus was drawing in the sand. And ultimately, at the end of that story, you'll recall that he says, "Woman, where are your accusers?"
Yeah.
And so our founders, in trying to craft a trial, they decided that it's supposed to be a truth-seeking venture. And man doesn't do perfect. We don't do that. So when you hear people criticize the court system against a backdrop of or a context of it's not perfect, well, okay, but that's sort of spinning your tires.
Man usually messes things up.
That's what we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we do better than anything.
Yeah.
But a trial is supposed to be. It's designed to be a truth-seeking venture. You also have the rules of evidence that have been honed over long, long periods of time. Started with common law, things that worked, things that judges, the way they administered their courtrooms, things that worked. Exceptions to hearsay that tend to be inherently reliable, things like that. All of it is aimed at trying to produce the truth. Again, it's not perfect,
Right.
but I think juries do their best, and that's what a litigator is. You try cases.
But it was created from a perfect document, the Bible.
Amen.
If you're seeking truth, that's where you want to go.
Right.
We actually have a follower named the Truth Seeker that
We do.
usually comments on our stuff.
Okay, that's
Pretty
cool.
enlightening. So, um, where did you go to law school?
Went to WVU.
And so you did all 4 years at WVU?
It's 3 years
3
for
years,
law
that's
school,
right.
yeah.
Yeah,
But I went
okay.
there for undergrad too, yeah.
Okay. So why law? Like what, as a kid, what did you want to be and what drove you to be in law?
You're going to be disappointed with this answer because I was kind of aimless. My little brother went to law school before I did, and and it. I just wanted to do something where I could be self-employed, and it could have just as easily been dentistry, if not for my aversion to sticking my fingers in somebody else's mouth. That would kind of be a problem because you can't do it from across the room. So I naturally selected law. After my little brother Danny was already in law school, you know, we would talk from time to time. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, you know. And there's a lot of language stuff. I always loved linguistics. I was a big English guy because my mom was that way, I think. And so that's what I think that's what got me interested and kind of I focused in on that. And
Yeah.
Rest is history, I guess.
All right, so 25 years later, now you're running for circuit judge. What was the driving force that led to that decision?
Well, this is something I want people in Marion County to know, that because I do federal practice, which takes me far from here oftentimes for court, I run into lawyers from all over the state. And lawyers from all over the state of West Virginia hold Marion County Circuit Court in very high esteem, which is awesome, and it's deserved, frankly. We had a guy named Fred Fox who sat on the court on the bench for 41 years. Fred was a Vietnam combat veteran, got wounded there. His radio man got killed. Incredible guy. His grandfather was actually a state Supreme Court justice. His father was a lawyer. He was from Braxton County. And Fred told me one time, he said that everybody had him figured to be a lawyer. And then, so, as is human nature sometimes, he didn't want to do that. He wanted to rebel against that. He said he wanted to just lead men in combat, which is a peculiar desire to have. But he did that. He made it happen, and apparently was pretty darn good at it, pretty heroic, I should say. And so Fred, when I was what my wife would call a baby lawyer, I just really admired him. You couldn't know him and not admire him. And the court where he presided, it was always about, he was very respectful, very humble man for all of his accomplishments, very humble man. And he made the litigants feel the way they're supposed to, which is that they're the most important people in the room. And he made decisions on the law. That may be the biggest thing of all. It's a hard job for that reason. The commitment to impartiality is antithetical to human nature, and I mean, especially in society. You know people, and you say, well, gosh, I know that person, and that's what makes that job hard. Fred lived here his whole life and was on the bench for 41 years. Or you count on one hand how many people he didn't know.
Right.
Yeah.
And from time to time, those folks are going to meander on into the courtroom, and he's going to have to try and mete out justice under the law, and suffer the consequences because he held in such high regard the adherence to the law. When Judge Merrifield, Judge Janes won and beat Judge Merrifield, Judge Janes said, and I was still a young lawyer, he said that he just wanted to continue the tradition of excellence established by Fred Fox, or set by Fred Fox, which I thought was awesome. And that's a great statement on the kind of disposition I think a good judge has to have, which is humility. You got to be able to say, for Judge Janes, it seemed to me that he shared the same kind of sentiment I had for Judge Fox, and it can be a nasty business. You can have clients that are dissatisfied. You're always going to have somebody dissatisfied in any litigation. Somebody's leaving the room going, oh, darn it, how come I didn't win? So it's not easy in that regard. It doesn't. All jobs are hard, but I think if you can keep your pride in check and remain humble to the law, and treat everybody with respect that comes into the courtroom, I think you're ahead of the game. I think if you can do that, you're off to a great start.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
that's good. So you're saying basically you're kind of mirroring your career after Judge Fox.
Well, I'm just
with the standard that he set.
Yes, exactly.
And
I mean, I would
uphold that same standard.
That's right. I admired Judge Janes when he said that, and that would be my ambition as well. I don't have a whole lot of fire in the belly to be a judge. I love practicing law, and but I also would work my tail off to make sure I kept the Marion County Circuit Court in the high esteem that it's in now, statewide and beyond. When people come here, the courthouse is breathtaking, but when you go into the courtroom, that's where business is conducted, and that's where you got to try to get it right. And so you've got to have a work ethic. When you're getting ready for trial, it's nothing to put in 15 hours a day.
Right.
There was a judge that used to say that 95% of the outcome of a case is decided before you ever set foot in the courtroom.
Yeah, your due diligence, all that work.
Yeah, and there's a lot of stuff. It's like trials can be so factually intense, and because you're dealing with disagreements between people, which is oftentimes messy. But you've got to try and have a handle on that stuff. Another judge famously said that a trial is like a controlled explosion. It's like, you know, throwing a grenade in a room, but trying to be prepared enough for every bit of shrapnel, knowing that that's impossible.
Yeah.
But it's a dynamic process, so it's a fascinating process, and I think a judge has to bring a sense of calm. You have to have a knowledge of the rules of evidence, because if you do try cases and you come in there and the judge clearly has not done that, has not tried cases, it's going to really affect how trials are conducted. I guess worst case scenario, it affects that truth-seeking function that we talked about, and you can't have that. You got to be able to you got to be able to work your tail off, because if you don't do that, the people you owe your obligation to, who are the litigants, you're letting them down.
Yeah.
I always think that one of the least important people in the courtroom is the judge.
Okay.
Well, I was getting ready, like, so what's the role of the judge? And I think you just hit that
Yeah.
beautifully. I'm like,
Yeah,
wow.
nice transition.
So one of the things that's kind of standing out to me, though, is, so you're running for a circuit court judge.
Yes, sir.
This is not a political office.
Correct.
So give me that comparison. So what's the difference between running for a political office, which is not what you're doing, but you're running for judgeship?
Well, you know, I mean, in America, we have our republic is a representative democracy. It's not a democracy. I love when politicians tell everybody it's a democracy. It is not a democracy.
Democracy's at stake.
Yeah, and it's not a democracy on purpose, because our founders had a nickname for democracy, and that was mob rule. If anybody ever lived in a democracy, they would never want to continue that. Ours tweaks that and makes it a republic, is what it's called. Technically, you know, when you run for any office, I suppose that you are in politics. That's the parlance we assign to it. But the weird thing about running for judge, that's a great question, because the weird thing about running for judge is the first thing people want to know is, well, how would you rule if this happened, you know, and what would you say if this? And that's the one thing you cannot say. Every other politician has to answer that, and as well they should, because people want to know, well, what do you believe in? I mean,
Right.
before you get my vote, I need to know what you believe in. And so I tell people, I believe in. I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Constitution, always have been, the Bill of Rights. If you don't see our founders' commitment to God in the Constitution, you're just not reading it closely enough. When you read those two documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, it's very important to not read them separately, like in a vacuum. The Declaration lays out 20-some grievances that our founders had with the Crown in England. And if you don't read those grievances against the backdrop of the Constitution, you won't see that they carried those through to the document that ultimately governs us today. Which is just fascinating to me.
Right.
If you're not fascinated with that, somebody needs to show it to you. And we don't do enough of that today.
Yeah.
Well, you had mentioned even as well, so it's, how would you roll on this? Well, you haven't been presented with all the facts yet. It's just, you're giving me an overarching theme that I can't fully speak to yet.
Exactly.
But as a person who has personal beliefs and convictions, how do you balance that, though, in the courtroom?
Well, you gotta try to remove them. I mean, you can't have it's a fallacy to say I have no opinions about anything. You'd be a heck of a boring person, number one, but you wouldn't be a human. And
Right.
And so we don't want a computer at the front where we just punch a bunch of keys and he spits out a ruling. Although I suspect that's coming. Everything I read about AI, but I think you do have those things. You have your experiences in life, and not only do you bring them with you to the court. I mean, I'll give you a great example. Judges tell jurors, you bring your common sense with you into this courtroom. And it's going to influence how you decide this case, as it should. We don't want you to like check your common sense at the door and come in and say, gee, I have no beliefs of anything.
Yeah.
Just feed me whatever you're feeding me and I'll just pick one. So a judge is the same way. I mean, I think that, you know, who I am is probably largely because of my dad, my mom as well, my wife, Jesus. You know, these are things that are inseparable, and that's okay.
Yeah.
So you bring those things with you, but you make your decision based upon what happens in that courtroom. So the things that come in as evidence, you know, you don't consider things that aren't evidence. So if one side puts on a more compelling case, and you say, "Gosh, I think that side is if it's a bench trial,
Right.
and you say, "Gosh, I think that side is correct under the law." It doesn't mean you've made a philosophical opinion about the law that the litigation invokes. So if you can think of a statute or something that may be a really politically hot statute, it could come before a judge, and a judge could again, without a jury, because if you have a jury, the jury is the fact finder.
Right.
If you have a bench trial, that's just a trial without a jury, where the judge takes on the role of the jury, the fact finder role, not just the guy officiating the thing and making rulings on evidence and questions of law, but also the guy that at the end of the day says, this is what I think the ruling is going to be.
Right.
So you could have a case that's a really, if you can think of like something that's a politically hot thing, and it goes before a judge, and a judge that you think is probably personally feels sympathy toward that position, but he gets to the trial and he hears the evidence and says, you didn't put up. I mean,
Right.
I got to give it to this guy, because you have burdens of proof and things like that, and so that's part of being a judge. You can't sever who you are from being a judge, but you also can't supplant the evidence presented with your own personal beliefs.
So you mentioned jury trial. That's where you said that's the judge is kind of the least important guy in the room, because the jury is going to make the verdict. They're going to deliberate. Is that the word, deliberate?
Yes, that's right.
So, but on a bench trial, the judge's responsibility is to interpret the law, past precedent, and statutes, right? So
Yes.
that's where you really have to put your personal beliefs, your personal emotions at bay as a judge, correct?
Yeah.
And now, is interpretation of the law, is that the same as plain meaning?
Yeah, in fact, we have a thing called the plain meaning rule. That's another great question. I mean, this is what I love about our founders, and really the way that we are still in the wake of what America was designed to be, even though every time you turn on the TV, you're like, my God, what is happening? The ship is sinking.
Yeah.
But so many of these things were so brilliantly crafted with the same intention our framers had. The plain meaning rule happens to be one of my favorite. You can have people say, gosh, we got too many lawyers in the legislatures. And the great thing about the plain meaning rule about living in America is if a statute says, don't do X, you can't do X.
Don't do X.
There's no, for all of the complaints, many of them valid, about legalese, where people say, how in the world do you come up with that? That is frowned upon. When you're talking about interpreting a statute, a judge doesn't get to just go adrift and say, or use his personal philosophy and say, well, I don't believe this, therefore I'm not finding that way. A great example of that is some of the decisions that went up to the Supreme Court, the Second Amendment decisions. We lived in this country for over a century without anybody asking whether the Second Amendment that says the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, whether that meant the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There are some things in the Constitution that applying the plain meaning rule to is another way of sort of saying unelected people, like a judge, we're elected, but we're not lawmakers, let's put it that way. Non-lawmakers don't get to make law from the bench. So the plain meaning rule is awesome because every American can know, gee, my attorney said, this is the statute that's going to be important in my case. And he can read that statute according to its plain meaning, the plain, ordinary meaning of those words, and feel pretty darn confident if he's in a court of law, a judge that doesn't elevate himself to the position of lawmaker, but instead restrains himself and says, I am not the lawmaker. I'm the guy that says, what does this law say?
So does that lead to people potentially practicing judicial activism that you see today with, we know that there's the interpretation of the law. We know that the plain meaning rule, which, like you said, it says don't do X, let's not do X. But then you might have someone that does have a political agenda behind their belt, and they have the power to do so. So is judicial activism active today? And maybe you can explain and elaborate on what that might be.
I will tell you that I've always believed that judicial activism is antithetical to our system of government. I can't say it more profoundly than that. We have separate branches of government. We used to teach kids that in 5th grade and even before that. And they can, for anybody watching this, I promise you they can learn it. If we go back to doing that, I sure hope we do it soon. but judicial activism is a judge saying, I want this outcome. And so I'm going to start with the, everybody goes through a legal analysis, and every judge, that's the hardest part of the job, I'm sure, is trying to figure out, because oftentimes, we're talking in hypotheticals about one statute being at issue. It could be much more than that. It could be a case that invokes multiple statutes, maybe some precedential Supreme Court opinions and things like that. And it can be a little tough that way. But judicial activism is what you kind of asked earlier, that that's kind of a judge saying, I want this to be the outcome. Well, when he does that, he makes himself a tyrant. Because in our system, we are, as they say, a nation of laws, not of men.
Right.
Well, if that judge says, this is what the outcome is going to be because that's what I want, well, then he just defied that fundamental precept of what it means to be an American.
Right.
Judicial activism is the idea is you're legislating from the bench. And that's a horrible miscarriage of justice. And I also think it would, even for people who disagree with me on that, we had some Supreme Court justices like Justice Brennan and Thurgood Marshall who said that stuff about how the Constitution's a living document. Even if you think that makes sense, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, it does burn the whole house down, because what is the purpose for our elections? Why do we have those?
Right.
If some person in a black robe can say, no, it doesn't mean that, in derogation of things like the plain meaning rule, it doesn't mean that because I have the power to say that. And that is a tyrant. You just can't have that. And I think it over time, what I would say to people who do believe in that is, please don't become a judge, number one. Number two, I would say, if you think you want that, if you think that's preferable to what we have, I promise you, the other side with whom you disagree will someday take power, and you will live to regret that.
Yeah.
Isn't it a much greater thing that you could come into a courtroom in America and know that you're going to, know what the law is already?
Have a fair and balanced.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
So could this lead to ethical limitations? If a judge says on one side of the aisle, however someone might believe, I want this to happen, but then on the other hand, I strongly believe that this should not happen. I mean, is there any kind of ethical limitations that a judge could face?
I mean, that is an ethics question, I think, and the judicial canons have a stricter standard than other normal lawyers, even prosecutors would have. Like a normal lawyer is held to one standard. A judge has to avoid the appearance of impropriety, so he doesn't even have to transgress into or violate a particular canon. But if he does something that creates the appearance as though he has, that's a pretty heavy standard. And so, in practice, the hard thing is, how do you say, gosh, I'm not sure that judge ruled on the law. I think he just had his mind made up all along. I mean, that's one of the great things about being in Marion County. We've never had to worry about that. In my whole practice, we've never had to worry about that. Now you see why I'm telling you how important it is to have judges that are really just the anchor to the law. That's what they are.
Well, it also reminds me of how the Bible says we should be above reproach.
Right.
We should set a standard to where our ethics or our beliefs are not even questioned. That's who they are as a person.
This is the standard. This is how we're going to live by it.
And I want to bring up, because every time you talk about the Constitution, you light up.
Yeah.
And you're a self-proclaimed constitutionalist. What is that?
Well, I mean, it's what everybody used to be in America. Like we talked about, I mean, some of the things that came long after the death of our founders still adhered to it. I mean, look at Congress today. We don't. What is the constitutional authority for a statute? I mean, shouldn't every lawmaker in Congress know that? Shouldn't every? Because we have a system that's hierarchy of laws. So the Constitution in America, because of the supremacy clause in the U.S. Constitution, that is the top dog. And below that would be a federal statute enacted by Congress. The state's very similar. I mean, we have a hierarchy of laws. So in our state, if the legislature, say, enacted something that violated a constitutional provision in the West Virginia Constitution, it would be void ab initio, meaning because it is in the backseat, it takes a backseat to the Constitution itself, it cannot be upheld. When we learn about checks and balances and stuff when we're kids, two of those checks and balances are already written in the Constitution expressly. The other one comes from a case called Marbury versus Madison, where it was determined, the concept of judicial review was sort of enunciated, even though I suspect that it was already there. When you create a federal judiciary and a Supreme Court, of course, that's where you would go with things about, questions about the constitutionality of a statute. The reason they say that phrase is because a statute cannot violate the Constitution, precisely because the Constitution is the highest form of law in America. And the same is true with the state. So our founders could write down things that would keep us on course. And I always say the Constitution is our keel. You can legislate it in a really wide array, especially at the state level. Some of the things that people are out there buzzing about now is a Supreme Court opinion that just came down that talks about some of the Reconstruction amendments. Those changed the balance of power between states and the federal government tremendously. In many ways for very good reason, and in many ways for not such a good reason. There used to be a whole line of Supreme Court cases on the state's police power. And it didn't just mean law enforcement and actual police, but it meant the state's ability to sort of be unique. In one particular state, you might have a sentiment about how you wanted your state to be run, and the state had pretty wide latitude to do that, because in our system, the federal government is supposed to be a loose network or umbrella over 50 little sovereign nations.
Right.
And it's not that way since the Reconstruction amendments. There's very good stuff in those amendments. I mean, the 13th Amendment outlaws slavery and badges of slavery.
Right.
14th Amendment gives us equal protection, things like that. But it's, when you go back and read those cases prior to post-Reconstruction amendments, they probably will be met with especially in today's standard, where people feel like things have run so amok. That phrase we talked about, being a nation of laws rather than men. Boy, it sure doesn't seem that way. It doesn't feel that way in America anymore. And I hope that's a fleeting, temporary thing. But you could actually, I think if people would read those cases about that are on, hey, what is the state's power? What are its limitations? And they were pretty well reasoned, pretty neat opinions, and it lets America be different. Where every, some people say, well, gee, the 50 states are all like little laboratories, and they are. So somebody comes up with a great idea in one state's legislature. Another state's legislature can borrow from that and say, they had a great idea, we should do that. But if it flops, then everybody knows, well, we shouldn't do that. So that's kind of neat. Other countries just have a national government. We don't have that. We have a federal, that's why we're called federalists, or federalism is what we have. It's fantastic. And it's, as for the lighting up part, I promise you, kids would do that too. You can't read true American history and be bored by it. You cannot do that.
I agree.
I defy anybody to do that. I mean, you give somebody an hour to tell the story of Henry Knox going up to Fort Ticonderoga, where Benedict Arnold, the ultimate traitor, led the Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys up there to take Fort Ticonderoga. It still gives me goosebumps today. And it used to give everybody goosebumps, because if you know those things and you know the triumphs of human nature,
where we came from.
Yeah,
where we are now.
I mean, that alone that's just one story, but it's a major piece in how Washington was able to drive the Redcoats out of Boston. All of the cannons, that we didn't have that. The Brits had filled up, the Brits had a navy, we didn't have a navy. They had an armada, which we found out in the Battle of Brooklyn not long after getting them out of Boston. But the Henry Knox story, I promise you, will give everybody with a pulse, it'll make their hair stand on end, and they'll be like, oh my God, what an incredible story. That guy is one of the most incredible human beings, among other incredible human beings. Nathaniel Greene, George Washington. And there's so much, George Washington attributed every victory in the Revolutionary War to divine providence. He knew what that was. The
Right.
prayer at Valley Forge is a great story. That painting, we know that's true because in that time, everybody kept diaries on both sides.
Isn't that
Sure,
amazing?
yeah.
So many of these miracles that he wrote about, and I mean, I think he was left no choice, nor would we be if we truly read American history. Just the miracles that happened when they crossed the East River to escape from after the Battle of Brooklyn, all the way down. They're being pursued all the way down to the Battle of Trenton. Another incredible story. And talk about snatching victory from the jaws of defeat. Oh my God, Henry Knox. We could have never had that first victory driving the British out of Boston if it weren't for those cannons. That he didn't fight with you know, a great story about that. Benedict Arnold, the traitor, ultimately pride was his downfall. He could be a biblical story. He financed that expedition and others. He bankrupted himself, pouring money into the Revolutionary War effort. And unfortunately, his wife was a Tory, her father was a Tory, and they just worked on him, I think, over time. And ultimately, he agreed with a British major to hand over George Washington, which he tried to do at West Point. And even the story about how they caught that major is I'm telling you, you can't get through a single battle in the Revolutionary War without multiple miracles. And if
Yeah.
you can find another explanation for him, I'm all
I'm
ears.
fascinated with history too. I'm reading a book called Swamp Fox.
Oh my God, Francis Marion.
Yeah, Francis
He
Marion.
was my dad's favorite.
Yeah, it's really
Amazing
interesting
man.
the history that goes behind all this. Go ahead, Josh.
Well, I was just thinking, history.
That's where our
American-
county gets its name,
Yeah.
from Francis Marion.
Yep.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
And
the
Marion
Swamp
County,
Fox.
South Carolina, obviously.
Yeah, Marion County, South Carolina as well. That's right.
Well, I'm hearing you talk about these stories, and I remember being in grade school, like a young grade school student, and we used to take such pride in our country and what our forefathers did to us.
Yeah.
100%.
Right, we were talking about, and I have some notes about how was it the Constitution was ratified in
87.
1787, and it's been under attack ever since. Like, when did we go from loving our country and what these great men did before to where our kids aren't even learning that anymore?
Well, man, that's a great question. How much time you got? I can tell you this, the birth of the progressive movement in the very end of the 1800s, beginning of 1900s, there was a concerted effort to do that. And even in the schools, even though the We the People program survived for many decades after that, it ultimately was killed by the NEA, the National Educators Association. Every American should know that. Why would you stop teaching what makes America different? Why
Because
would
they
you
want to change it.
Precisely, and that's the progressive movement in America. And you can read all about it. It was the Communist Party in America that said, "Hey, we're frustrated. We're never going to get communism." And back in those days, at least you could say people who ran under the communist banner, there was at least some honesty to that. They didn't conceal who they were. They were enemies of the Constitution and self-government. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Sir, that just seems so hypocritical. So you're against the Constitution, and the First Amendment is the freedom of speech.
That's right.
I mean, so how can you be against the?
I'll tell you my philosophy on that because I could talk for hours about
Broods
that.
of vipers.
Broods of vipers.
It's a very sinister movement. The Communist Party, which was an actual party in America, you had card-carrying communists, just like you got card-carrying Republicans and Democrats. And like I said, there was at least a certain honesty to that. I mean, communism is a death knell for humanity, and that's been proved 25 times. It's 0 and 25. But and all it really ever succeeds at is mass starvation, mass extinction of humanity, mass incarceration, tyranny, all those horrible things. But if you know the history of the Progressive Party, that it started among the Communist Party in America, and they said, "Gosh, we're really frustrated. America has a Second Amendment. We're never going to be able to take this country by violent overthrow." And so the Progressive Party was born that famously said, if we spoon feed America socialism day after day, day after day,
Under a different name.
we will one day we'll awake and we'll have communism. So we've done that. Like I said, when people make laws in Congress and there's no reference in the statute whatsoever to what its constitutional authority is, that's mind-blowing. We have programs that have no constitutional authority whatsoever. It's amazing, and we get that because in self-government, it's us, and so if we don't know, the progressive movement gave birth to a lot of surreptitiousness in government, where you are constantly on the sly. So it's like, watch this hand, but look, don't look what I'm doing over here, like a good magician. And so that's how we lost so much of our liberty, I think, was the progressive movement. There's a great story on one of the worst presidents in history, Woodrow Wilson. Here's a guy who was a Democrat. Every year, somehow, they always ask people to rank presidents. He makes it in the top 3 every year as a Democrat. I mean, they do it for both parties, I think, but that guy was awful. I mean, he aired the Birth of a Nation movie, the KKK movie, the movie that was made to glorify the KKK. He aired it in the White House, and yet people say the guy was great. He grabbed up a guy named W.E.B. Du Bois, who was probably a very smart man, but also had communistic tendencies and had a lot of, I think, I don't know if I want to call it pride, just partly pride, partly bitterness, and boy, can that go a long way. That's what the undoing was for Benedict Arnold. He pride and bitterness.
That's a rough combo.
It is, you know. It's you think about a guy like Benedict Arnold, who was a phenomenal commander. The battle at Saratoga, which was huge, was Horatio Gates. General Gates was given the kudos for that, but it was he was going to lose the day. He was much too conservative. This story alone about a guy who ultimately becomes a traitor is a goosebumper as well. This guy is wounded, okay? Benedict Arnold is at the Battle of Saratoga. He's wounded, and he's cursing and screaming as he's getting drunk, because that's how they try to ready you for surgery. He had a bullet in his leg, I think. And he's extremely upset about the way Horatio Gates is conducting the battle. And ultimately, after a few belts of liquor, he jumps back on his horse, still wounded, rides out, does a flanking maneuver, I believe, on the Brits, and wins the day.
Wow.
Now, after that, he wanted. See, this is where the difference is. What were they trying to get? There have been no shortage of revolutions in world history. That's what you do. We kill each other and we go for power and all that other, because that's what humans truly are, but for the Bible, in my opinion. And if it's not the Bible, you better find something immovable that's going to keep you from, becoming this prideful thing. That's our perpetual wrestling match. But Benedict Arnold rode out there, won the day, and you know what? That's great. His men thought he was a hero. He thought he was a hero too. And from that point on, he thought he should be promoted to the rank of general. He thought he was a far superior officer to Horatio Gates. That day he was.
Right.
This is a man who, before that battle, like I said, went up with Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys and beat the Brits at Fort Ticonderoga, but they left everything there. That's why Henry Knox went back for the Boston maneuver. We didn't have cannons, and the Brits were very comfortable in Boston, and so but for Henry Knox, we would not have driven them out of there. But just really cool stories like that. Like what was the undoing of an otherwise selfless and heroic man? Poured everything he had into the revolution, which was a disappointment to his wife, and ultimately helped her father and Major Andre. That's the British general who ultimately, the thinking is that Major Andre was the one working on her father and her, ultimately turned him. But you couldn't have turned him if he didn't leave that opening in pride. Washington ultimately did elevate him to the rank of general, but it was too late. He had already sealed the deal. He had already...
It's interesting you keep coming back to the term pride, when one of the things we started this with was, in order to be good in judgeship, is we have to swallow that pride and be humble.
Oh yeah. If you don't, you're going to be a train wreck for the people that come in front of you and want justice. And you're going to say, I am justice. I'm the authoritarian, and that's just totally wrong.
With that pride comes the desire for power and control.
Yeah.
And then in this society where there's the existence of individual liberty and government power that are competing opposites with one another, it's not even a secret anymore. It's kind of in plain sight, this battle. So Patrick Henry once said, You know this famous quote?
Oh, yes.
Give me liberty or give me death,
yeah.
during the Second Virginia Convention. So what does a country stand to lose if people lose their liberty and the government gains all control? What do people stand to lose?
Well, then we're like everybody else. And that's a real shame, because the way we are today, with lack of morality, lack of understanding of even human nature, what drives me crazy is the progressive movement sort of, and it still does this to this day, it wants us to be something we're not. It almost feels like, it used to be a battle between the philosophies you had on politics. Now it seems to me to be a battle between good and evil. I don't know, like we said a minute ago, there have been innumerable revolutions in world history, and no lack of dead bodies as proof of it, no lack of tyrants that came to power as proof of it. But only one revolution in all we know of human history resulted in man's liberty, and that's this one.
Right.
Yet you go, you turn on the TV, if you can still bear to do that, and you got to watch these young kids out there carrying signs. This is fascinating to me. The First Amendment has 5 rights in it, and if you watch a lot of the protests today, I'll use an example that's a really low-hanging fruit, because people are incensed, and like we were talking earlier, you got to be careful about what you buy into. The heart has to be tempered by the mind, and so you may watch a group of young kids or college kids protesting hate speech, saying we need to end hate speech. Okay. Nobody likes hate speech that I know. Nobody I want to hang out with engages in hate speech. But be very careful when you do that. These kids are out there, and they're using 3 of the rights in the First Amendment. They're using the right to peaceably assemble. Hopefully it's peaceable. If it's not peaceable, I suppose it's Antifa.
It's always peaceable on one side.
The right to peaceably assemble, the right to petition your government for a redress of grievances, and the right to speak freely, to not be able to get arrested for no matter what it says on your sign. The problem is when you read the sign, it says end hate speech. So those kids are using 3 rights in the First Amendment to ask government to end the First Amendment. And people don't realize that the Constitution is a big chain on a bad dog. That's all it is. It was never designed for you and I to sue each other, or it requires state action. It is simply a thing that puts a fence around humanity, beginning with the notion that God made man, and therefore who is his fellow man to deprive him of certain unalienable rights, which are set forth in the Constitution and the Declaration. So, the idea that you can abandon all of that. You can say, government, I want you. You're what the Constitution keeps out of my province, out of my inalienable rights. But I want you to end that. Is amazing to me. When you think about how people fought and died long before America, for concepts of human liberty or oppression beyond the ability to tolerate it. Thomas Jefferson writes about that men are predisposed to long endure known sufferings. Isn't that true? People don't talk like that anymore because we don't know that about ourselves. We don't know what we are. It's true. We will stay under a known yoke at some point it'll become unbearable and you'll have a revolution. But as I said, in all of history, only one revolution has resulted in man's freedom. If you held a rope from that wall to this wall, and that was the time span of all human history, the part on that rope that represented individual liberty would be as narrow as my finger, maybe narrower. All kinds of systems of government. Our founders were arguably the most brilliant people on political philosophy ever to sort of come together in a confluence of geniuses. And they relied, unsurprisingly, predominantly on the Bible. That is the most relied upon source for the Constitution and the Declaration. People don't realize.
Go ahead, sir.
I'm sorry, no.
No, Josh mentioned that, it's been under attack for this long, since 1787, and I believe that's why it's ironclad, because it was under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. They were almost prophetic in their words, how they wrote the Constitution, as if someone someday is going to talk this way, but this is still going to stand. I mean, you even look at the Second Amendment.
It's amazing.
We have the right to bear arms. It doesn't say anything about a musket, like some people say, well, they were talking about muskets because that's when they wrote it. No, right to bear arms, to protect us from a tyrannical government.
Yep.
You know, that's plain rule, if you ask me.
And to preserve our lives. You know,
Yeah.
one of the things our founders looked to in God's world, because there are rules out there. They're all around us. For example, can an animal defend its young?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And we get to see that, don't we? We get to
Right.
see. I mean, there's nothing more profound than a rabbit.
they actually have shows just for that.
Yeah, yeah. There's nothing more amazing than a rabbit who, once cornered, with just his young behind him, will go on offense against the
Yeah.
fox. Well, who thinks that's a winning idea? But he will do that. And why will he do that? What gives him the authority to do that? He doesn't think like us. He doesn't have this gigantic frontal lobe. Why does he do that? And it's not just him. It's all his other rabbit friends do the same thing. It's amazing. And so some of the concepts you're talking about, they simply observed nature and said, what is man's rights? What are natural rights? And some of that stuff is fantastic. It's true. You have a right to defend yourself, because the idea is the life that's been given to you is a precious gift.
Right.
And so, of course, you have the right to defend it. And I would go farther and say you have an obligation to defend your loved ones.
100%.
So yeah, I mean, it's like I said. I mean, I could talk about this stuff all day because I don't believe that people disagree on the Constitution. I do not believe that. I believe there is so much conformity to the brilliance in that document and in the Declaration. The only problem is you have to know what it says.
Right.
Before you grab your sign and say, take away my rights, take away my rights.
And that one, I want to go back to two things. I don't know if you give me so much information, it's kind of mind-boggling. But some of the things you said that stood out to me was, one, I want to use my free speech to hinder somebody else's free speech. I don't agree with racism. I don't agree with sexism. I don't agree with Nazis or anything like that. But I would like for them to be able to speak their piece, so I know that's the people I need to avoid. Because if I don't let them speak their piece, then they're just going to hide in the shadows. And they're going to work from darkness. And we need to expose that in the light. I think that's the coward's way out. What you said offends me. Where in order for any of us to speak freely, we have to be able to be offended and to be challenged so that we can grow as people.
Man, I couldn't have said it better myself. That's a great observation, and it's true. You know, our founders called they didn't start with the right to free speech. They started with freedom of conscience. That one of the unalienable rights is the ability to think for yourself. But what use is that if you can't speak about it? You know, you go clear back to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. Thank God those guys were free to teach, because those formed the basis for civilization as we know it.
Yeah.
You talked about the part of like stymieing somebody else's speech, and you're right, that is intrinsic to the example I gave. But what's even more mind-blowing to me is that they're taking the right away from themselves.
And they don't even realize
Right.
it.
They don't, and that's the thing. Our founder said you cannot be both ignorant and free, and you don't have to be a guy that's a master with the slide rule or in physics or anything like that. Human nature is something that society has worked hard to unlearn. I mean, we've put a ton of work into being this misguided. At some point, you start doing things that are dangerous to society when you no longer understand what humans are and what they're capable of. And you're right. You know, how do you say to your son, hey, you hear that bigot over there? Don't do that. We don't do that at our house.
Right.
But like Ben Franklin said, I may disagree with what he has to say, but I will defend to the death his right to say it.
Right.
Because it used to be all Americans agreed on what our formula is. Our formula is, hey, you know what? That guy can say some things that disgust me, but he can't cage me or take away my liberty. He can't do that.
Right.
The government can. And so nowadays it's been made into this thing of like, oh my God, when you start talking about founding principles, it's, you're some kind of crazy. Well, if you don't talk about them, God help us, because I promise you, they're going to become very evident to all of us once again. there was a president who said, freedom isn't in our DNA. It has to be fought for and defended with each generation, and that's true. It is. When I talked about that rope, the time continuum of all humanity, we are the exception to the rule, like a star-crossed collision that happened. Well, you know why it happened. I don't know if it'll happen again. If it does, it's not going to be like a year or two. We don't have people who understand. Again, we would have to start all over. We don't even understand human nature. We spend so much time wanting to change it or wanting to regulate it, and it's like you made a great example. How do you know who the bad guy is? I'd rather have the founders brilliantly observed this. All the debate you want to have about the First Amendment, it comes down to two options. The first is you have a truth police. That's always the government. And you can see how that went in the Soviet Union or any other collectivist society. I promise you, truth will be as the farthest guidepost away from their determinations about what is true. And for more on that, you could read George Orwell's 1984, because truth can become the opposite of what you and I would know to be truth. That's the first option. You either make truth police, and we see that today. We see that in social media that reaches tens of millions of people. They're going to take your free speech down. Now, those are private entities, but they are protected by statute. They're immunized by statute. And so the idea is, can you be the arbiters of truth? That always ends horribly badly. And the other option is the marketplace of ideas. So let's say we all three go to some public gathering, and we're going to hear some people talk. We're going to hear a Nazi, some kind of a bigot, and we're going to hear a guy talk about unalienable rights of every human. We get to make up our minds by hearing that.
Right.
We don't just get to where we're at. This is what drives me crazy today. We're dumber than we've been in, I think, so long, but we feel smarter. We feel really smart.
There's just too much stuff out there for us to read and get our hands on. Internet too quick. We just Google something real quick and we get probably lies. We're not really educated by the real history.
Or you just get that headline, and
And
you're
then run
getting a
with it.
statement, but you're not getting all the details.
You're right,
Yeah.
and that's responsible journalism has gone out the window. So it's
Yeah.
the first story.
Yeah.
You got these cameras. First story out is going to be the best one we go with. So you talk about truth, and you're seeking truth. We talked about the Bible is the source of the truth. If no one knows the truth, if no one knows the Word of God, if no one really hangs on to where our rights come from, morality takes a nosedive. So, we have morality and law. So, like, if regulating morality is off limits, how can we justify criminalizing all the things we criminalize right now if they're just saying morality is to the wayside?
Man, that is another fantastically probative question. I mean, there's an attorney who I respect very much named Jonathan Turley, because Jonathan Turley could never really fall into a category of political belief. But he is a big believer that the government cannot legislate morality. Now, this is what we talked about a minute ago in the Reconstruction Amendments. States used to be able to pretty much do that. I mean, bestiality laws. I mean, if we can't legislate morality, why can we make bestiality illegal? Why can we make child rape illegal? So it's sort of a chasing a mercurial object when you finally come back to the conclusion that, well, of course we do that. Like you just said, I mean, we legislate against rape. We say rape is illegal, and you'll go to prison for it.
Which is right.
If we don't have morality, how do we come to that conclusion?
Right.
If we don't have Cain and Abel, how do we decide murder is wrong? And again, that goes back to the fundamental belief that the Constitution is a document of life. It prizes the individual above all else.
Life and liberty and
yes.
the pursuit of happiness.
Yep.
Life.
And the idea is we are supposed to be self-governed. There's not supposed to, one of to give you an idea how far I think we've strayed from that is, it used to be your whole life didn't hang on who was elected president.
Right.
Because under Article 1, Section 8, it limits the power and the reach of the federal government. We talked a little bit about how the Bill of Rights philosophy came later, but the argument for that occurred in the crafting of the Constitution was this. there were many, but the winning side of the argument was, look, we're just going to limit governmental power. We've been there. We've seen it all. We've researched ancient civilizations, Lycia, the Roman Senate, long before when Rome was a republic. People, the one that's in the movies, the version of Rome always has gladiators and guys with the scabbards, and that's cool. But that was after they descended into an empire. An empire derives its name from the fact that there's an emperor. And they had this light switch thing that they could flick off and on to go from a republic to a monarchy or a dictatorship in times of war, because they felt like a dictatorship is much more nimble. It doesn't have to, you don't have the Senate weighing a vote while an enemy is overrunning you. The problem with that is it forgets human nature, and you can do that for a while until somebody says, we're going to leave that switch to the dictator position. And Julius Caesar comes back with his troops and crosses into Rome proper, which was a huge no-no. And he famously said the die is cast. When he brought troops across the Rubicon River, he was in Rome proper as a commander, not allowed to do that. But who tells him? Who tells him that? If you're going to flick that switch on, you better kind of be aware that that guy is coming back with all those gladiators, all those warriors. You're going to do what he says. It's just a matter of time before some man says, I like this, I can get used to this, and he did that. Gosh, I went so far afield from what your question was now, but...
No, I think you're hitting the nail on the head there, talking just basically morality is going the wayside, and we're...
Well, it goes both ways, though. To your point, if we can flip that switch on at any time, eventually there's going to be someone that's corrupt that's not going to let you turn it off. You've given them too much power, and again, back to pride, it's went to their head now. And we have to be able to be self-centered. I'm self-centered around my faith in Jesus, but if you get someone who isn't, or someone who believes themselves to be above the law, then now that they are the law, then we've given too much power to the other side. Because like you said it earlier, be careful what you ask for, because if you get your way this time, eventually the exact opposing side is going to have that authority over you.
Yes. And let's take what you just said a little farther. I mean, you made a point about how now I've lost my train of thought. If you're right. I mean, once you here's what you said that I thought was brilliant. Yeah, write that down.
I don't have a pen.
If you flick that switch on, and this is the thing I wish people would understand in America. We watch the news, and there's some god-awful thing that humanity is doing, and we say, oh my God, government needs to fix that. I can't believe government doesn't fix. That's our first instinct. We just immediately abandon the idea that we are self-governed. We're supposed to be self-governed. Once you give government that power, it may feel great. It may feel great in the heart, but how do you turn that off? How do you? Our Constitution is supposed to guarantee us what the federal Constitution says is the Fed Constitution actually guarantees that every state will have a Republican form of government. Republic is, like we said before, it's a representative democracy. And what people don't understand is human liberty, individual liberty, and government power exist in the same sphere or same pie chart. This is one of the many brilliant observations about you think, who thinks about these things like this anymore? They exist in the same pie chart, so that as one expands, it necessarily intrudes into the other. So when we watch the news and we say, oh my gosh, that's terrible, we need to regulate that. Well, the government's always happy to regulate things unless you have men like our founders that said, whoa, I'm not sure we want to give government that power. We did all that stuff about the Bill of Rights thingy. That seemed like it was a great idea. Why would we continue to expand government? That's why Article 1, Section 8 limits the federal government's power. And then the Bill of Rights that comes along 4 years later in the 10th Amendment says, hey, because we know how humans are, and we will destroy ourselves, we will ask government to be our mother and our father.
When have we not done that? We'll give up our rights just to feel safe.
Yes.
Okay, you may feel safe for the moment, but what about your kids and your grandkids? Are they going to feel safe, or are they going to be persecuted and oppressed by the same power you give the government?
I forget who it was, but someone was quoted saying, if I exchange my liberty for safety, you have neither.
I think it was Ben Franklin.
Ben Franklin.
And it's better than that.
These guys are really smart.
Oh, and that's what you thought the same thing I did when he was saying that. I was like, my God, you're quoting Franklin. I mean, and listen to this quote. Those who would trade liberty for the promise of security
Security, yeah.
deserve neither and will lose both.
Oh, yeah. That's,
That is a statement of human nature. You
deep.
don't have to like it, and you don't have to tell me what year it is in all of human survival. It's always true, and it always will be
profound
true.
and always true.
And so we say, oh my gosh, we need more security. And so as you do that, you lose your liberty. Eventually, one of those forces inside that pie chart is going to prevail. Mm-hmm. And to a great extent, there's a lot of legitimacy in the fight itself. I mean, the whole reason we have a government that we divide the branches in is because our founders looked back at monarchs and said, gosh, how do they do that? Let's define this and say, what are these powers a monarch can exact over his citizenry? And then we'll split them and divide them against each other so that they're fighting each other. Is it supposed to move fast? No. Just like the Romans found out, if you want it to move fast, it doesn't end well. Yeah. But people that criticize the government today say, we need to be able to do this, we need to, and you get these laws that are enacted in 15 minutes, and they tend to be 3,000 pages long. The Constitution.
that no one reads.
No one reads, but
Except that Obamacare thing. You have to pass it before you read it.
Yeah, imagine that.
This is like Nick in the Starbucks thing.
Yeah.
Here's the Constitution, and that's on tiny little pages. You could read this in
and
an
it's
hour.
ironclad.
Yeah.
So,
But
I think we go ahead, sorry.
No, I'm just going to say, so we this is another thing. We can't remember what humans are because we want them to be something else, it seems to me, which is awful. Think about this. Like I don't even know if we respect humanity anymore. We sure seem like we have a lot of virtue, but how much of it is actual virtue or biblical virtue? How much of it is false virtue? Who's in the worst situation today? A person who shakes a baby to death, or a person who takes a baby lamb and throws it onto a tire fire? Who's going to make the news across the nation? The lamb.
The lamb.
Both are horrible and intolerable and deserve criminal punishment. There was a case like that years ago, but that is the one that will go around America. You will see that in tiny little towns across America as their headline news
all
story.
over the place.
Well, you were talking about pointing things at both sides. I think because, and we talked about it earlier, political identity. Whoever I am politically, that's who I am as a person. Mm-hmm. And it's that divide and conquer mentality from, I'm losing the word all of a sudden. It's not the upper class, but it's the elites.
The elite, yeah.
If I get Joe and
The
John
1%.
arguing over this in the middle, they're going to be focused on this so we can conquer and have our way over here. And we both know that both political sides have some fine people in them. They also have some pretty ignorant people.
Yeah, sure.
And one of the things that you had said that reminded me of is they're so preoccupied with what the movement wants, they don't even realize it's not in their interest. They're just trying to win a fight that they shouldn't even be in.
That's another great point, and that's when we were kids, and my dad would get a bird dog, and we'd train the bird dog. You never let him get the feather. So you might have a grouse feather or a ringneck feather, and you never let him get it. I mean, you're trying to get him hooked on that thing so that it's the most important thing in his life. And it's fascinating to watch a bird dog. That's one of the many miracles of creation. You watch that guy, and a good one it's like an art form watching them. But what you just described is the same thing. I mean, we Washington warned about having a party system or a two-party system. And it's true. We forget all about the Constitution. Nobody can tell you what the Constitution says anymore. We don't teach it anymore. But everybody can tell you what the news is coming out of Washington, D.C., that Republicans want to do this, and Democrats want to do that. And nobody ever asks, well, maybe both ideas are stupid and harmful and unconstitutional. Is that possible? Yeah. Well, you will only know that if you know what the Constitution says. Otherwise, we just listen to the party stuff and we say, oh, I like that guy in that party, and therefore whatever he tells me today, that's the most important thing.
And whatever he can do or she can do for me.
And they don't even have to know what he's saying. They can just be charismatic about it. And that's the ignorance and the dumbing down of America.
Yeah.
One of the things we talked about it earlier, and we've talked about it the last couple of episodes on the podcast, is if we have a foundation of truth and there is a standard set, and this is in the reference to the Bible, that if anything comes against that, then this document knocks that down, and we don't even have to waste our time on it anymore because of this verse, this state, that whatever. And that's the same thing as the Constitution. But yet we have so many people that are like, yeah, but they even challenge the authority, or they go after the people that wrote it and try to
Oh, yeah.
to bring that character down. Well, if it wasn't for those people, we wouldn't have the freedoms that we have. We wouldn't have the greatest economy that this world has ever seen. And the amount of we talk about, does America have a dark past? Who doesn't? What country doesn't? What person doesn't have something in their past that they wish they could undo?
But because of the standard.
But because of the standard, we try to tear down everything we can to undo the Constitution.
And so a great example of that is, what if we don't know what the standard says? You know, in the Dark Ages, you could be burned at the stake for being in possession of a single page of the Bible. So if we don't know what it says, we'll be led around by the nose like cattle. What about if we don't know what the Constitution says? Same thing. You know, a great example is, I think if you sat outside of what I love about today is Americans are talking about the Constitution again.
Sure.
There is no America. Everything we know and that you just listed would not have happened. It's not. There's not some blessing in the dirt here or some DNA. We don't have different DNA than other people. There's not. We're not born into liberty. It was fought and died for. I mean, here's a great example of how if you don't know about the standard as you described it, whether it's the Bible or the Constitution, how will you know when you're its enemy? How will you know when you're your own enemy, like the kids we described? Think about this. If you stood outside the average grocery store, probably in the last 10 years, and you just said to people as they came out, hey, what's your favorite part of the Constitution? Or just make it easier than that. Tell me something you know about the U.S. Constitution, this greatest governing document God ever gave man. You'd probably hear about 80% of them say separation of church and state, which has never been in the Constitution.
It's not even in there.
Not even
No.
there.
I know that.
and you know where that comes from? So that's not an accident. I mean, you could think it's an accident. You could say, boy, that's a heck of a well-contrived accident, because how is it that 80% of Americans can name only that as being in the Constitution when in fact it's never been there and never would be there? It actually comes from a letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote to the Connecticut Baptists when they were, because, and this is another thing that drives me crazy. You got these historians, you got to be really
I
careful.
love it's historical.
Yeah.
Well, you know,
give so much personality to.
if you I mean, does anybody think, granted we don't learn the Constitution anymore, but does anybody think that a letter some guy wrote is law? Who thinks that? No one.
No one.
But that's where that comes from. And people, even historians in America, that try to, as you said, destroy some of the founders, because it makes it a lot easier for us to surrender our rights if we can tell everybody, hey, you know, that was just invented by a bunch of rich white slave owners, which is not true on any of those accounts. But you know, if you don't know those things, you'll lose them. You'll lose them for sure. Separation of church and state. Thomas Jefferson was an absolute Christian. I mean, even his daughter wrote about how when his wife died, he was never without his Bible. People say all these lies about Jefferson, and one of them is that separation of church and state letter that he wrote to the Danbury Baptists. What Jefferson hated was what he called priestcraft. He, because I said those guys were geniuses on human history and human nature and what things made us go dark. And his belief was that, you know, there's a great body of history after the collapse of the Roman Empire. We talked about the gladiator stuff. After it collapsed under its own weight and gave, actually partly because of the Moors as well. You know, there was the Byzantine Empire, the Far East Empire, which is now Constantinople, because the Christians and the Crusaders lost that fight, and so that empire became the Holy Roman Empire, which was Western Europe. And there's a great story about King Henry, who was the last holdout to not kiss the ring of the Pope, and so he went to give the Pope a bit of business and say, "I'm King Henry." Didn't end well, and so. People don't realize there were times in history when we had multiple popes sort of behaving just like monarchs would. We'd have more than one pope, and suddenly one winds up with a knife in him, and that's what can happen to humanity. You know, you can be a person who's a believer, But are you then freed from human nature? Do you have some kind of a brand on you that doesn't permit you to engage in pride and sinful thought? Of course not. And if we don't remind ourselves of that, we're gonna be in real trouble. The Danbury Baptist story is just Thomas Jefferson got a letter from them, and that state had said, "Hey, we have a state religion, and it is not Baptist." And so the Baptists said, "Oh my God, they're going to drive us out of Connecticut." And so they wrote to Thomas Jefferson and said, "Hey, in the Constitution that you guys wrote, can they do that?" And he said, "No, we have built a wall of separation between church and state." He didn't mean keeping church out of government. He meant keeping government out of church.
Yeah.
In the First Amendment, not only do we not have that malarkey about separation of church and state. My God, the movement in America, the anti-God movement, or whatever the heck you want to call it, has gained more steam under that lie than just about anything.
And so
And
quick.
it's perpetuated over and over again by our leaders.
What it actually says in the First Amendment, we talked about 3 of the rights. Another important one is the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. So it says Congress with a capital C. That means the United States Congress, the legislative body that it makes federal law. It's in D.C. now. Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of a religion. That's what Thomas Jefferson couldn't stand. He was far from being anti-Christian or anti-religion. That is just simply malarkey. There's been a lot of really crafty lies told on that, but none of them is any more persuasive than the separation of church and state crap that we just talked about. You just have to know it. But that is the thing. That's what we keep coming back to. You have to know these things. They're fascinating to learn. They really are. And they will. They're not. I think the other big lie in America is that, oh, the Constitution is so hard to understand and it's so tough, and it's not. We don't want to go back to the 1800s, and it's like that is the parlance of a person who's never read this, or a person who doesn't want you to read it.
Right.
But that was all Jefferson was against, was priestcraft. He didn't want there to be. He didn't want to give to have a state say you can't practice your type of religion here. So that's what he meant by that, and that's what the Establishment Clause means. That except the Establishment Clause, being in the federal Constitution, says Congress can't make an official religion for the nation in the same way that states can't make an official religion for the states, but they can also neither can prohibit the free exercise thereof.
Yep. So I'll let you ask the final question here in a second, and we'll bring us home. I just wanted to throw what you just said reminded me of this. Elijah and Baal in the book of Judges.
Yeah.
It was, you bring your God.
It's a throwdown.
I'll bring my God.
Yeah.
And we'll see who wins.
Yep.
And to the extent the church, one of the things I've never understood is we're gonna have our religion and our beliefs here, but no one else can. Why is your faith so? Why are you afraid you're gonna lose your faith if somebody comes in? Because I believe that if you take my Bible and my church up against a different religion, I'm going to win every time, because it's truly a book of love. Mm-hmm. And if I'm so afraid that somebody's going to come up against me, that's going to question my faith, do I have faith in God or do I have faith in my faith?
Yep.
That's 2 different things.
Yeah.
Truth.
And at the end of the day, I mean, like you said, it's you're a believer or you're not a believer, and that's. I mean, I tend to agree with you. I think there's been a lot of writing, and I wouldn't say that, some of those scholars necessarily had malintent. Some people believe in predetermination, like Calvinism and things like that. I think, like what you said, hits it out of the park. I don't think Jesus was a fan of religion. No. I think he was just a fan of God.
And he loved people. And that's the other point I was wanting to make earlier, and was when we cherry pick the Constitution, and then we add things to it, right? For example, Bible says, love your neighbor. Doesn't matter what their race is, what their sexual preference is, what their size is, where they came from. It just says love them.
Yes.
Right? So I don't get to pick and choose what I want to follow from the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. That's just the standard.
Yes.
Why can't we just accept the standard for what it is, and then just deal with people one-on-one instead of putting them in a group?
Yeah, I agree. And when you put them in a group, you run the danger of leaving the system that we're governed by. Ours says you are the preeminent thing under God. Ours says that God made you, and it's a miracle. So God is up here, he's at the top, and you're here. And like Alexander Hamilton said, the challenge in crafting a government is, in the first place, to craft a government that can govern. And in the next place, to impose sufficient controls that it governs itself. They always recognize, like we talked about in that pie chart, they always recognized human nature is a fickle thing. And we do dumb stuff, and we depart from wisdom, whether that's religious wisdom, whether that is, you go back and see some of these tests from the 1800s. My God, these kids were geniuses compared to where we are now. Ben Franklin had a full-time job at the age of 11.
With less resources.
Yeah, exactly. You didn't have TV, you didn't have radio, you just had, the original public school textbook was the Bible.
Yeah.
Benjamin Rush, one of our founders, I think he may be one of the few, one of the 6 or so that signed both the Declaration and the Constitution. Genius of a man, and a devout Christian, said, remember we talked about earlier, they said you cannot be both ignorant and free. When we talk about that time continuum of humanity, the belief was some of these things we're talking about, they bait you in, don't they? Like when you say, gosh, we need to have a cognition test because our president doesn't know what day it is. Okay, that actually happened to Woodrow Wilson as well. He was locked away in the White House for a long period of time until finally there was enough stir in the Congress that they got the guts to say, we're going to go over there and make sure he's alive or that he's still okay. And he had a stroke, and people feared that, gosh, is his wife signing these bills? What's going on over there?
Is he a puppet? Yeah.
But be careful, because when you say we want to impose a cognition test or something like that, you've just done something that is a substantial wound to what we are, to what self-government is.
Right.
Now you're going to create a brand new agency, yet another federal agency that says, that is the gatekeeper. You can't run for president. You can. You can't. If you think that's not going to be captured by one political party and the other, it'll be the same crap we go through today. Self-government is the opposite of that. It says, I trust you guys. I don't care whose names are on there. If you guys vote for the name that I think is the stupidest guy on the ballot, that is self-government. That's a victory for self-government. Now, we could talk about how, gee, I wish we would talk about the Constitution again, because it would help us to know who to pick. But you see, that's a classic example of how the heart draws you in to something that's antithetical to our system of government, to self-government. We say, we need a test. And it's tempting, because you say, gosh, we do need a test.
Yeah.
But what we really need is to return to more freedom rather than less. Since the birth of the progressive era, we've been lying about what a human is. And that, when they started that, it was called the 100-Year Plan, by the way. When we talked about spoon-feeding people on socialism until one day we'll wake up and we'll have communism. That was what caused that split between the Communist Party and the Progressive Party. Yeah, it's a scary thing, but they're right on schedule. They're a couple years overdue. But who could come up with something like that? It's unbelievably evil, and it's surreptitious. As I said, at least when we had a communist party in America, for as wrong-headed as that is, and that you can't have a more Satan-esque version of government. And I tell you what, you don't have to take my word for it. Take it from Karl Marx. There's a great book written by a guy named Paul Kengor, and there's actually an earlier book written in the 40s by a man who was a pastor in Romania and lived through Nazism. People don't know this about Karl Marx, the father of communism. Marxism is what he called it, but it always devolves into communism because it's antithetical to human nature. At its root, that is always the same problem. We are not a collective organism we are instead, you have your own DNA, you have your own thumbprint. You guys don't look anything alike. None of us looks anything alike. Why is that? You go out and look at raccoons. They may have a little bit of different appearance, or deer. They may have a little bit of different fur here and there. But we are made to be this way. We are supposed to be able, if you don't believe man left to his own devices won't always create the greatest outcome for himself, then you're just not studying that. One of my favorite examples is the Wright brothers. People know the Wright brothers. They know their name. What they don't know is they had nothing to do with aeronautics or avionics. Or aviation. They were bicycle repairmen from Ohio. Yeah. You say, how'd they wind up in Kitty Hawk? It's a great story. But here's the best part, most teachable part of that story, is that at the same time, the Wright brothers were working on their dream. That's the beauty of liberty. Your dream is never going to be like my dream or his dream, but it's going to be something awesome and beautiful. If you believe in a creator, don't you think that glorifies him? And even if you don't believe in one, don't you think that's cool? There's so many stories about how Americans have done things and evolved, and it can't happen but for liberty. So at the same time, the Wright brothers are working on this lifelong dream that just occurred to two bicycle repairmen from Ohio. The federal government, in its infinite wisdom, did what it does today. It said, wait a minute, there's a real genius here in America, and he's got a lot of education. He's been to school a lot. He's got a lot of abbreviations after his name. We're going to commission him to come up with flight. He's going to gain flight for humanity, and we're going to pay him $1 million to do it. And what he came up with was like a slingshot, and a great way to take flight and submerge it. What he came up with was launching planes from a riverboat, thinking that the updrafts, if you could aim the boat the right way and use its velocity and also aim it at the wind, you'd get lift. Well, the two bicycle repairmen beat him to the punch, big time. And I wish people, when they tell the story about the Wright brothers, if you're not telling the other side of that coin, there's free men, two free men, who work on bicycles. And there's a guy that the government says is the smartest guy among us. Why? Because he's been to school a heck of a lot. One of the coolest things about West Virginians, and one of the coolest things about campaigning that I've experienced, to be quite honest with you, is the amazing people I've met right here in my own town, right here in my own county. It's amazing how you can live someplace for 25 years, and practice law here for 25 years, and you know, as a lawyer, you don't meet people. A car salesman meets people, 100 people a day. Lawyers just beat a path back and forth to the courthouse. I mean, if I did this for another 25 years, I'm not sure I'd know more people than I do now. Yeah. But campaigning has changed that. I met a man who flew a B-25, who was a phenomenal man. If you heard his story, you would say, that would make a great movie. Yeah, and he's from Marion County. I met a guy who was ex-Special Forces, an incredible man, that if you looked at him, you'd never guess that's what he was. Like in China, they tell you what you're going to be. They wouldn't have told this guy you're going to be in Special Forces, but he wanted to be in Special Forces and became damn good at it, incredibly good at it. Just like the fellow that flew the Flying Fortress. I mean, that is the cool thing about liberty. Government will always try and supplant that. And you don't have to believe that it's evil and they're hatching some scheme that's antithetical to humanity. I think if you said that today, you wouldn't be far off. But
Ronald Reagan said it best. One of the last things you want to hear is, I'm from the government. I'm here to help.
I'm here to help. Think of that $1 million that they paid that man and the two bicycle repairmen. And the reason they went to Kitty Hawk was to accomplish the same thing the genius on paper wanted to accomplish. But there's only one winner in that race, and it's the individual. It is the Wright brothers, and they deserve to have a plaque and everything. They deserve all the, because look at what we do with commercial aircraft and things today. And again, all of the advancements like turbojets and things like that. But compare that to a place that's predicated on collectivism. There's another great story like Mike Owens from here in West Virginia. Mike Owens was a guy who worked in a glass factory. And there was a very wealthy man, I think from New York. I know he lived in New York, named Mr. Libby. And they had a strike at that plant. Well, long story short is they burned that plant to the ground. And you can learn all about that down in that glass museum in Weston. It's pretty cool. Mike Owens, when you hear that Owens Corning, that's a guy from West Virginia. Okay. And Mike Owens just was a worker in that plant. I think he may have been a shop steward or a union foreman. So Mr. Libby's reaction was, okay, you just burned my plant to the ground. What you would think, and what postmodernists like to tell you, is we're all class envy. That's a tool of Karl Marx. One more thing to divide us. Class envy, race, and everything else. Like you said, we're commanded to love everyone. And that's a great thing that's echoed in the Constitution. It says, all men were created equal. All. And that's something I can live with and I can get behind. And but there's never going to, the people who want to pull us apart like that are never going to stop. We should remember that, and not. We should realize that man's liberty is a thing that was fought for, and it's not a long ago fight. It's a fight that goes on every day.
Yeah.
And Mike Owens is a great example of that. Mr. Libby comes down from New York, says, "Okay, I want everybody, all my employees, whoever wants to come to I think it was Wheeling. I want to have a meeting with you guys. I have a plan." So they come to Wheeling. I'm sure not all of them did, because like I said, it was a pretty nasty union fight apparently between him and the company. But the guys that went up there included Mike Owens, and at that meeting he said to them, "I'm not going to rebuild the plant. It's just too hostile an environment to do that in. But any one of you who wants to come with me to where I'm going to build the new plant," which I think was going to be in Illinois or Indiana, "I will pay to move you and your family there, and you will have a job there." That's amazing, because today when people want to tear us apart on class envy, it doesn't mean that every rich guy or every factory owner was some wonderful human being. But my God, can't we tell those stories too? Can't we tell people that there are good people and bad people? I don't care what their paycheck says. I don't care, what religion they are. There are people that say they're Christians, and you could say, I don't know what's in your heart, but maybe it doesn't seem that way. But I know we're imperfect. The thing I love about Christianity is you look at the heroes in the Bible. Boy, are they not heroes? Yeah, they're imperfect people, which is what we are.
Yeah.
But there's a reality in that lets you not think you're beyond humanity.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, Mr. Libby did in fact move Mike Owens and all the other guys that wanted to go out there. Mike Owens took a job out there, and Mike started making glass for Mr. Libby. One day, Mike had an idea for how to improve the glass making process and make it more efficient. So what do you do? Well, he's this bottom level employee, and Mr. Libby is this super wealthy guy, and by God, you can't make it up that ladder,
right.
can you? Well, in America you can. And Mike said, "I want to have a meeting with Mr. Libby." And so he got the meeting with Mr. Libby. He came in, Mr. Libby shook his hand. Who wouldn't want to work in a place like that? But it gets better. Mr. Libby says, "What's going on, Mike?" And Mike proceeds to tell him what Mike would know better than Mr. Libby, right? And he's free. He's not stuck in a plant like in the CCP or in the Soviet Union, all wearing the same gray suit and doing the same thing all day because that's what the government tells him to do. Instead, freedom unleashes what your identity is, what your dream is. And he could have just sat down there. He was darn good at making glass, but instead he had an idea. And he dared to come to Mr. Libby, and Mr. Libby, by the grace of God and by a measure of what kind of man he must have been, said, "Come on." Mike comes in and says, "Here's my idea." Mr. Libby listens to him. Mr. Libby is a super wealthy man. Mr. Owens is not. But Mr. Libby listens to that idea. He says, "Mike, can you sketch that out for me?" He said, "Sure." "Okay, because I'm going to give this to my guys and see what we can do with this." Now, if you listen to the Marxist version of life, oh my gosh, what happened next, Craig? I bet you when Mike left, Mr. Libby took the patent and everything else.
Stole his
right?
idea,
Stole it
yeah.
for himself and ate his kids. And that's just not true. Now, you can tell, and truth should be our guidepost. So we should tell stories about bad things in American history. If you believe America's perfect, again, you got a real problem, because humans aren't perfect. We don't do perfect.
Yeah.
But instead, Mr. Libby has Mike come back up sometime later after he's had his engineers look at that and after he's had his legal department look at it. What his legal department did is registered a patent. So far, which way is this going to go? Well, he asked Mr. Owens to come back up. And when Mr. Owens comes up, Mr. Libby is proud to hand him a patent that bears the name Mike Owens. Mike Owens. I mean, if that's not a goosebumper,
Yeah, that's
I mean,
awesome.
that's a great
really
West
cool.
Virginia story, because that guy had ingenuity. He didn't just show up to work and stamp it out. He took pride in his work, which you only see in freedom. You only see that in liberty. To cut to the chase, Mr. Owens wound up registering innumerable patents beyond that, and he became Owens Corning. He and Mr. Libby became lifelong friends, and that's a little old guy from West Virginia who worked in a glass factory
In America.
in America.
Who was brave enough to speak out.
Brave
Yeah.
enough to speak out, and in a country where, we talked about this earlier, the free market is antithetical to hatred, right? I mean, it has certain controls built in. You may say, well, that guy across town charges me $50 more for this same thing. The great thing about the free market is you may not want to pay for the thing that you need, but you don't have to go to the guy that charges $50 more. You can go to this guy.
Yeah.
And Mike Owens is a guy who has a darn good idea. Mr. Libby sees that. I don't know what was in Mr. Libby's heart, but he was smart to say, this guy seems smart. I should keep him. Then I should promote him. Then he's going to come up here with more and more patents, which he did.
Yeah.
And ultimately, he became an extremely wealthy man, and we know him today as Owens Corning. He had several companies. I think there was a bottling plant here in town that bore his name.
Yeah. Well, and that's the beauty of good leaders is they surround themselves with smart people, and they're willing to listen.
Exactly.
In America.
Exactly.
Well, Craig, we appreciate you coming on.
Hey, I had a blast. I appreciate you guys
So what we've
listening.
gathered from this is that you are for the Constitution.
Yes, sir.
You're for truth.
Yes, sir.
You're for liberty and justice for all. And
Right.
we believe that you are for Marion County.
Yes, sir.
So if you can look at this camera right here and talk to the voters, this
Which
middle,
one am I
this
looking
middle
at?
one right here.
Okay.
And kind of get your message across, what you want the voters to know about you and why they should vote for you.
Well, let's see. We've been going at it for a while here. And what can I add to that? I guess if what I have to say appeals to you, this is how great America can be. This is how great the justice system can be. There was a time when no matter what party people belonged to, we all celebrated the Constitution. We celebrated our liberty, like that Ben Franklin quote we said. Even on matters of First Amendment, you use the term friction. You have to be able to accommodate friction in a society if you want to be free. But you know, the reason I'm running for judge, as I said in the opening remarks, I just have such a high degree of respect for our court system. Our court system in Marion County is the envy of the state, and it ought to stay that way. And that would be something that I would hold in such high regard that there would be no end to the effort and the work that I would put into it. That's just what I want to do. If I'm elected, I will do my best to live up to the traditions in Marion County and the standards that we talked about.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys
thanks for
very
coming on.
much. Yeah, it's sure nice meeting you guys too.
absolutely.
Getting away from my my technology here. Gee whiz.
All right, so this is Josh, Ryan, and Craig
Yep.
with Mountaineer Kingdom Dude Talk. Check out we're on every social media platform that I can think of. Twitter, TikTok, Spotify, Apple Podcasts.
I'll try to think of them.
I just can't. So check us out on YouTube if you want to drop us a line, have any questions, mkdudtalk@gmail.com. And just thanks for joining in.
Like and share.
Yeah, I was trying to get away from that one.
You're not going to get away from that.
Well, that was great.